with no exhaust gas recirculation system, high compression. When I say high compression, I'm talking 9.8 to 10.2. The non-VVT motors in the trucks are a little bit higher compression. They're usually over 10 to 1, because when you phase a cam and increase cylinder pressure, advance it, you need to lower the compression ratio. So the VVT motors run slightly less compression. So an L99 might be 9.8 or 10.2, where an LS3 is 10.5. It's a little bit higher. So the Gen 5 motors can run extremely high combustion chamber temperatures because GM spent millions of hours in CAD design on the cylinder heads for complete combustion. In a standard engine, if you go back to the 80s, they were running in the low 90s maybe as far as efficiency goes. That means how much hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are raw fuel. Carbon monoxide, CO, is partially burned fuel. So what goes in the engine is primary air, which is oxygen and nitrogen and some trace gases, and then fuel, hydrocarbons, whether it's gasoline, alcohol. What comes out the tailpipe is what matters. And 1.5% oxygen is what we want coming out the tailpipe, because it is used during the combustion process and the converter process to turn bad gases into good ones. Well, the fewer the bad gases get into the exhaust manifold, the better. Now, in the early days, at 90%, 95%, 5 to 10% COs and HCs are getting through into that exhaust manifold. So by going to a secondary combustion or secondary air, you can now you have fuel and you have heat in the combustion chamber, in the exhaust manifold. You apply some air, and it helps complete combustion outside of the combustion chamber, which doesn't do you very much good as far as power goes, but it does reduce the emissions before it hits the converter. And then we have the converter, the final line of emissions control. And converters are very difficult to understand, but basically they combine oxygen with other elements to create harmless elements. So CO into CO2, HCs, COs, and NOx into H2O, of course that's water, CO2, O2, which we want about 1.5%, and the end result is a very clean tailpipe. So, 2 decades later, we're running 320 horsepower out of an engine that's smaller than a 190 horsepower engine that's buried with emissions control equipment just 15, 20 years ago. And we're putting out tailpipe emissions that are almost clean enough to breathe. So when you look at a modern operating system, what that means is there's not a whole lot left to get out of it. They've maximized performance while keeping safety, emissions, reliability, longevity, all in the mix. Sure, you can add spark and fuel and get an extra 50 horsepower, but what's the flip side? The flip side is you're probably going to reduce the life of the engine by turning off or desensitizing NOx sensors to get more spark, or turning spark up. You're putting more stress on the engine. By messing with the VVT or putting a cam in, you're increasing cylinder pressure. Now you got to remember, GM has to make sure these engines run here in Nevada where it's 120 degrees, but the same vehicle can drive to Alaska where it's below zero and still function with the same engine and operating system. So if you are in a specific environment and you're not going to leave that environment, there are some legitimate gains to be had. So when it comes down to tuning, whether it's a Gen 4, Gen 5, Gen 3, you're not going to get a much better overall result than what GM has delivered to you. You can get more performance, you can get better mileage, you can get better emissions. I experimented at length with lean cruise. Lean cruise is no longer legal in North America because of the NOx emissions. When you lean a motor out like the old Honda stratified chambers or lean burn engines that Chrysler had, yes, you can get 17, 18 to 1 air-fuel ratio, but you are increasing that combustion chamber temperature to the point that you're creating NOx. So you can get benefits in performance, economy, but you're going to lose somewhere. You're going to reduce the lifespan of the engine. You're going to lose economy. You end up cranking your PE, performance enrichment, up. You're going to see your mileage drop. So there's not a whole lot to be gained unless you really know what you're doing. Now you put a high flow intake on it, then you put a tune to match, let's say Edelbrock or Comp Cams or whoever, you might get 5-10% better performance without really sacrificing anything, because some of those guys know what they're doing, but it's not going to be much. It's not going to be like the old days where you could put a cam in a 305 small block and go from 150 to 250 horsepower. You might go from 320 to 340. Working within the stock tune, we can actually pick up 5 to 10% power. GM is very conservative on performance enrichment, like I mentioned. GM is very conservative on rev limiters. GM is very conservative on spark and how they bring it in and how they monitor it. So just working with the stock calibrations, we can pick up 5, 10, 20% performance. Now this is an LS3, and this is a 4-door with tons, so it's a pretty heavy Jeep, and this LS3 will have no problem pulling this Jeep wherever he wants to go. I have put LS3s in 2-doors with 5-6 inch lifts, and I'll tell you, it's Mr. Toad's wild ride. So I tend to go a little conservative on the tune. Now if the suspension is solid, it doesn't have torque steer, it doesn't have dive steer, it's not crabbing, the camber's right so it snaps back to center, this Jeep does have hydraulics on it, then we will do a little, we'll warm the tune up a little. We're not going to sacrifice reliability or economy or emissions, but when we install these engines in JKs and we build our exhaust systems, which do run converters, full-size converters, we make them a little bit freer flowing. Our intakes are freer flowing. We're running a 4-inch to 3.5-inch aluminum tube, mandrel bent. So basically we have freer flowing exhaust and freer flowing intake than the restrictive manufacturer's intakes, which are molded pipes and tubes with honeycombs and you name it. So we're getting an extra 30-40 horsepower to these LS3s. We're dynoing them at over 450 horsepower, and it is more than enough for most JKs. If you want more power than that, we can do a 480 horse, we can do an LSA, we can do an LT4, but at that point you're just a hot rod. You're looking for a JK that's a muscle car. An LS3 and even a 6-liter will pretty much haul a heavy JK wherever you want to go in style. I'm cruising at 70 right now, and I can't even hear the engine. All I can hear is tires and wind, and it's having zero issues keeping this speed. It's not going to downshift, it's not going to struggle, it's barely under a load. So a 6-liter is, I would say, enough for the average JK. You don't need any more than a 6-liter. The 6-liter will run on regular gas. It's an extremely reliable engine. It does have an iron block. I do recommend the 6-liter L96 or the 5.3 LMG if you live north of the border of the states and you're in very cold climates. The iron motors handle the cold well. In addition, the air fuel management, if you can stay away from air fuel management motors in extreme cold temperatures. Early on with the Gen 4s, GM did have some issues in the below freezing temps, and what the deal is, a lot of things are controlled off of oil pressure, including the air fuel management lifters. There's a lifter manifold assembly that hydraulically controls pins in the lifters to disable the lifter and turn that cylinder into an air spring. And it works fine. However, GM found that mechanism was susceptible to oil pressure, high oil pressure, and it would crunch. Too high of oil pressure, over 70 psi, would crunch the mechanism, and your AFM lifters would fail. GM installed a DOD or AFM oil pressure regulator, a second regulator inside the oil pan.